Hey guys, Kat Clay here. Today I want to talk to you about how to write a psychological thriller. Chances are you've happened upon this video because you've typed into Google how to write a psychological thriller, and it is the exact same search that I did when I was starting out writing my very first thriller. One of the things I found kind of frustrating was that there's a lot of general advice out there, but there's not a heap of advice from people who have actually written thrillers, because it's quite a hard genre to quantify into craft terms. Now, I have written a psychological thriller, I've done the hard work for you, and I wanted to share some of the tips I learnt when I was researching it and also writing it myself, and the things I discovered along the way. So stick around, hit subscribe, and let's get into the psychological thriller. I promise that is the last time I'm doing weird voices in this video. So I think it's important to sit down and define what a psychological thriller is to start off with. So a psychological thriller is a story where the main character experiences a deep psychological conflict because of external circumstances, usually in a situation which creates paranoia and suspicion and causes them to question their sanity. The protagonist must confront the very depths of their character in order to resolve the story. And it's for this reason that psychological thrillers need to have strong character arcs, because it's about the internal resolution of conflict as much as the external story itself. And I'll get into that in a second. But I thought it would be helpful to have some examples of great psychological thrillers. Now, you can't go past the one and only The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn is another excellent example. The Talented Mr. Ripley by Patricia Highsmith. Shutter Island by Dennis Lehane. The absolute classic Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin. And of course, Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Now, that is like a who's who of psychological thrillers, and you can see here that actually, if done well, a thriller has the chance to actually become an instant classic because people cannot stop talking about these books. So my biggest and first tip is that it's psychological for a reason. It might sound obvious, but a psychological thriller is about balancing the internal and external conflict of the story. There needs to be as much internal conflict as there is external conflict. If there's too much external conflict, like there's explosions and helicopters dropping from the sky, it becomes a regular thriller. And if there's too much internal conflict, it runs the risk of navel gazing and becoming a boring book. As you're writing, you need to allow space in the narrative to express the character's internal conflict. So it's not just action, action, action all the time. There needs to be pauses and ebbs and flows where they reflect on how this situation is affecting them and their psychology. Now, this next piece of advice is probably borrowed from William Goldman's Adventures in the Screen Trade, which is a great book if you haven't read it. And it's to start with familiar emotions. Now, there are so many domestic thrillers out there, and contrary to this kind of belief that you have to start your thriller in a familiar location, you actually just have to start it with familiar emotions. So not every one of us has been an FBI agent, but we can all affiliate with Clarice Starling's willingness to do a good job and also to impress her boss as she's starting out in her career, while fighting this kind of embedded misogyny in her day-to-day life. And this is something that is actually quite universal, especially for women. And it's, I believe, one of the reasons that this is such a successful book, because we can all come alongside her at the start of the story. So my next tip is that the biggest enemy in a psychological thriller is the self. It is not the antagonist, as terrifying as they may be. The protagonist might be investigating a small town mystery, they might be investigating a crime or uncovering secrets, and that is a vehicle for them understanding themselves. It's really important that you map out how your main character will deal with their internal conflict through the story. So from start to finish, there needs to be successful resolution, and I'll talk about the endings of psychological thrillers in a minute. Now, one of the biggest tropes in the psychological thriller genre is the unreliable narrator. With an unreliable narrator, The main character will appear normal to start off with, but as the story progresses, they become more and more unhinged until the reader realizes that the main character is lying to both themselves and the reader. And that can be really intriguing in a psychological thriller. And this is one of the reasons that psychological thrillers are often written in first person, to get really close to that internal conflict and that potentially unreliable narrator. Often this comes from the narrator themselves having a mental health condition. And I will say that it's really important, unless you have lived experience of the particular condition that you're talking about, to do your research and make sure it's represented accurately and well. And to be an unreliable narrator in a psychological thriller doesn't necessarily make you the bad guy or a psychopath. It just means that they are not telling the full truth to the reader. And that's your choice as an author. And I think that can be quite a good trope to pull on in this genre if you're doing it well. There's a really simple way to make your story compelling, and that is to make sure that every single character has a secret, and you don't tell them all on the first page. You drip feed that out to the reader as the story goes along. So an author that does this, who's a crime writer, Jane Harper, in her book The Dry, she does this so spectacularly well. Every single chapter, at the end of the chapter, there is a new snippet of information that keeps that reader going, what happens next? Who done it? And you need to make your protagonist work for those secrets. So not everybody is going to open up about the 30-year-old mystery that's haunting the town, because they need to have a reason for keeping those secrets hidden. What have they got to lose by giving this up? And think about how the protagonist can persuade them or convince them or intimidate them into giving up those secrets. And then that will begin to construct your compelling narrative as you plot those markers out. Now, I talked a little bit before about walking a tightrope between kind of two ideas. Now, this is a thing that becomes very important in terms of plotting a psychological thriller. If you look carefully at books like Rosemary's Baby, they tread this tightrope line of asking two questions. Is it baby brain, or is it an actual supernatural occurrence going on in this apartment block? If you look at any good psychological thriller, you walk the tightrope between two questions at once. So in the case of Gone Girl, the question is, did Nick Dunn kill his wife, or was she abducted and killed? And it walks this tightrope so very well through the story that you're not quite sure. Having this balance of two questions that could both be true is essential to writing a page-turning thriller. And I think it's actually one of the key craft things you can take away from this. Think of the two questions that you're going to try and answer through your story, and both could be equally true right up until the end. Now, I tend to be quite a heavy plotter when it comes to these kinds of novels, but I do like to leave the ending open. And the reason for this is so I can discover the answer to that question while I'm writing the book. Having said that about leaving the endings open, it's really important that you do plan your reversals. Now, a reversal is just the technical term for one of those great twists that you read at the end of any of the books I've mentioned. It's where you find out what's actually going on, and it might be quite shocking, as in the case of things like Rosemary's Baby or Gone Girl. Who can forget the endings of those books? But it's really important that you plan those out. And this is where your editing comes in, because you're not always going to get a reversal or a twist right on the first go. But it's important to incorporate them more into your passes. So you might have this great idea come to you as you're writing the book, you write the ending. You need to pepper clues as to that twist throughout the story without giving it away to the reader, so that when they go back to the start and go, oh yeah, that was that. It's really hard to do right the first time, and it will take a bit of beta reading as well to learn where the balance is of too much and too little information. The other thing is that your reversals should come at the key points in the narrative, the halfway mark in the story and the conclusion, like the very last couple of pages. I mean, Gillian Flynn does this amazingly well, so check out her work if you haven't already. And on that note of reversals, I do want to talk about the endings of psychological thrillers. Now, psychological thrillers tend to fall into three main ending types. Yours might have a completely different ending, that's fine, but I think it's helpful to break these archetypes down so that they can help you in your writing. The first type of ending is the bittersweet satisfaction. Now, upfront, I will say Psychological thrillers do not have happy endings, but there is a really delicious satisfaction for the reader when a character has been broken and put back together again. They've faced their demons, they've conquered their challenges, and they walk away from the story as a new person. Now, they're never going to be the same, but that is deliciously satisfying for the reader. And I love those kinds of endings because haven't we all been through tough times in life where we have to go through difficult stuff, get through it, and we come back stronger? The second type of ending is the revelation of true self. Now, this is the classic type of story where the narrator, it turns out to be a psychopath all along. And there's a whole spate of books that use this kind of trope. But the other part of this trope is that the protagonist could realize who the antagonist is all along, and they reveal their true self. So I think of a story like Gaslight, the classic film where the term gaslighting comes from, and she doesn't know whether she's going mad or something else is happening, and it's finally revealed at the end. The third type of ending is the one that is hardest to pull off, because it requires you to convince the reader of a change in reality for the protagonist. And that is the complete loss of sanity. It's more common in short stories. So I think of the fiction of H.P. Lovecraft. This was a common story structure for him as people faced the cosmic horror and the cosmic madness. So when done well, the psychological thriller can be an absolute classic genre to write in, and some of the most incredible novels are actually thrillers. The readers love them, they'll talk about them for years if you nail those twists and reversals. So I highly encourage you to explore this genre, to read widely in it before you start writing in it, and to just go for it. And hopefully these tips and tricks have helped you get a few craft tools under your belt before you start. If you have any questions, I love to hear from you in the comment section below. Likewise, feel free to share your own tips from your writing experience. I'm Kat Clay, and if you want more writing videos, more advice on writing for games, and just general nerd stuff, because I'm a mega nerd, please hit subscribe, and thanks so much for watching.